There is this very interesting detail in the story we read this morning from the Gospel of Mark. It's an interesting detail because it's not particularly noticeable. And in fact, it's kind of a rather puzzling detail. Now, the Gospel of Mark begins, as I said earlier, with these stories of healing and casting out evil spirits, or demons as they called them. And it's obvious for Mark that a significant aspect of Jesus' ministry was this healing and casting out of unclean spirits. It's obvious for Mark that that was a significant aspect of appeal to the community, to Galilee, the communities he's preaching, and so much so that the line says the whole city was standing by the door. Mark is filled with these stories of healing and casting out evil spirits. But the interesting detail I want to point you to is there's this line in which, as it says, Jesus is healing people of their illnesses and sicknesses. He was also casting out these demons, and the line goes, interesting enough, and he told them to be silent, to not say anything, because the demons knew him. That's an odd phrase. The demons knew who he was. And what's interesting about it, if you read through the Gospel of Mark, you would find the truth is that the ones who really know who Jesus is are the demons, whatever they are a metaphor for, or whatever they represent. That in fact, the Gospel of Mark, the best way we can characterize the Gospel of Mark in their picture of the disciples is that the disciples, far be it from them to be these wise people, in fact, his story about them is they kind of walk around and Jesus does something, and they say, "What? What did he just do?" That in fact, throughout the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are this confused and dazed people who don't quite understand or know who Jesus is. They never fully grasp who he is. I mean, you have Peter who says you're the Messiah, and Jesus says, "Well, you got that right," but then Jesus says, "Well, I have to take upon myself the cross." And Peter says, "No way! That can't happen. You're supposed to be the Messiah. You're supposed to be King of Israel. You're supposed to throw out the Roman Empire and throw out those in power." And Jesus says, "You don't get it." You have James and John who says, "Well, we know who you are. You're the one that's going to put us on your right and left, and we're going to rule over everybody." And Jesus says, "You don't get it. You don't know who I am." He's always asking, "Do you know who I am? Do you know?" And the only ones who do are those possessed by demons. That's an odd detail. And it shows up over and over again in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, the only time a human being recognizes who Jesus really is that as he's giving his last breath on the cross, there's a Roman centurion standing there. This is the only human being who truly recognizes the holiness of Jesus. And he stands at that cross as Jesus breathes his last breath, and he said, "This truly was the Son of God." So humans are clueless, but the demons, whatever they are, knew him. So what strikes me about that, and what I think Mark is trying to convey to us, is that it's only the broken people, the vulnerable people, those unclean, who truly see and know who Jesus is. That the radical idea he's trying to convey is that we don't know who Jesus is because we come from a position of privilege. We don't know who Jesus is because we are particularly healthy, but in fact, it's the hurting people who grasp the healing power of Jesus and what he proclaims and what he embodied. It's the broken people, the brokenhearted. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will see God. And so there's this radical idea that it's in the midst of hurting and brokenness and vulnerability that one truly encounters the healing power of Jesus. Now, that doesn't fit our culture. We're a culture of lifestyles of the rich and famous, right? Of the powerful. That's what we celebrate. We kind of don't like to pay attention to the broken people, the brokenhearted, right? We kind of shun them and marginalize them, the poor, the homeless, the refugee. We don't really like to see such vulnerability. That's every person an island, right? Pain and brokenness is not something that we even acknowledge in ourselves. We're more about the beautiful people than we are about the brokenhearted, even within ourselves. As if the gospel was for the prosperous. The health and wealth gospel. When in fact, the whole point that Mark is trying to convey is that really where we encounter God and Jesus, where we encounter true healing, is only when we embrace our brokenness and vulnerability. And I know that's a radical idea, the culture in which we live, and lift up those who are in control and those who won't even admit to being hurt or hurting. Now, one of the central aspects, most biblical scholars argue, that one of the central aspects of Jesus' healing is not simply focused on the physical healing, but one of the central aspects of what made that healing happen is that Jesus always invited these hurting and broken people who had been pushed aside and marginalized. He had always reached out and lifted them up and restored them to a community. That a central part of that healing is like the line in the story of the mother-in-law who's ill with a fever. It's a line, it says, in which Jesus took her hand and lifted her up. What's interesting about that line is that line shows up over and over and over again in Mark's telling of Jesus' healing. He took her hand and lifted her up. And the way in which Jesus ministers to the broken and brokenhearted and the vulnerable and in pain is he takes their hand and he lifts them up. It's a beautiful image. Months ago, on behalf of an initiative we Presbyterians are doing here in the state of Iowa, in about ways in which we can respond to mental health issues. If you're not aware, Iowa really has some challenges in that not having enough psychologists or mental health services or mental health places for people to go to. So a number of Presbyterians around the state were trying to figure out ways in which we could respond to that need. And so someone had asked me to speak to a person at Polk County, director of mental health services for Polk County. And so I went in and interviewed her and was interested in what mental health services were around. And she shared some amazing programs, things that are happening from support groups to kind of people stepping in when there are crisis teams, amazing things. And so I asked her, I said, well, what can we as a church, what's the most effective thing we can do? What is it we can do to make a difference in this area? And she kind of paused and she looked at me and she says, you know what needs to happen most of all? Is churches need to welcome the mentally ill. That churches need to be places in which they are welcomed and restored and accepted and loved. That the best thing a church can do is welcome them, to take their hand and lift them up. When I was in seminary, I had a good friend who came to the realization of an addiction to alcohol. He kind of came to this truth, this reality that it had been affecting his life, and he began to start attending AA meetings to help him kind of deal with this brokenness, this hurt, this pain that was ruining his life. And he invited me to come to his 1-year anniversary AA meeting, in which you get a chip for 1 year of sobriety. And he asked me to come, and I was excited to come. I was a little nervous. I'd never been to an AA meeting, and I didn't know what to expect. And so I come to that AA meeting, and I remember being overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by people sharing stories of such brokenness and pain. I couldn't grasp it. People who talk about their own brokenness and vulnerability and struggles, bankruptcy and the harm they did to their families and the struggles they have to get through each day. And I remember just being overwhelmed. I mean, the incredible honesty of sharing what they shared in that AA group among total strangers, in fact. And I remember just being overwhelmed by that vulnerability, that pain, that brokenness. There was so much a part of their life. And then the realization as they shared those stories of the power of that community to be healing. The sense they could share their brokenness and pain, and it was held by the community, embraced by the community. And it didn't fix it, but they were made whole. It was the kind of community that took their hand and lifted them up. This past Wednesday at our dynamic discussion, we had a panel of folks, of immigrants who shared their story. We had a young man who had to flee El Salvador after the death of his father, who came to this country under the Temporary Protective, TPS. He's been here over 10 years and has a family. Couldn't speak much English, but is working and faces the reality in another year or so that he who now has a kid in this country now may be facing having to be deported back to El Salvador, even though he hadn't been there in 10, 11, 12 years. Then there was a young woman, a DACA recipient, who shared the story of her family. Her dad was a lawyer in Mexico. She was a young girl, and he was a lawyer who was prosecuting the drug trade, and there was at least 2 attempts on his life. They decided to flee to this country when she was about 3 or 4. Her dad, who was a professional lawyer, was cleaning buildings and cleaning houses. About her own experience about being an undocumented immigrant, and the fear that DACA is yet to be resolved. Those questions answered her own fear. Here she hasn't been in Mexico, or she grew up and she understood herself to be a member of this country, and how she had been going to college and had to drop out. And, the challenges, the reality. And as they shared that story, there were about 25, 30 of us here listening to this, and I don't know about them, but I think I had a sense in which we felt and could experience their brokenness, their vulnerability, their fear, their uncertainty. And I know I wasn't alone, and hearing those stories of brokenness and vulnerability, there's a tear in our eyes, a yearning in our heart to make it whole. The question we have to ask ourselves, we who follow Jesus, is, are we that kind of community in which the hurting are welcome? Are we that kind of place where we invite the hurting and brokenhearted, and that they can find a people willing to take their hand and lift them up? It's a question we should always ask ourselves as a congregation. Are we a place where the hurting find healing? It's a question we should always ask. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.